Hello everybody and welcome. I'm Dave Isaacs for jamplay.com and this is week 6 of Finding Melodies from Scales. We've been exploring a number of different scale sounds, the way that the interval makeup of that scale is what actually creates the way that it sounds, and how you can learn to recognize the sound of particular scale tones to differentiate one scale or one mode from another. And this is a really different way of working from what you're accustomed to, probably. Or at least, if you are learning scales and modes, if you are learning the fretboard, you are probably thinking about patterns first. And there's nothing wrong with that, because that is the easiest way to learn to navigate the fretboard. Guitar is a very visual instrument. I would call it a geometric instrument. And I think it's very helpful to be able to see those patterns. And eventually, we learn to connect the visual, physical patterns on the guitar neck with the sonic patterns that we can hear. And I'm convinced that when someone has a natural gift, this is really the thing that they're able to do, is to hear a sound, have some sense of what that relationship is, and recognize when a physical pattern on the guitar creates that same relationship, that same sound. We all can learn how to do that. It's just some people can do it naturally. Some people need to actually learn how. And in order to help with your understanding of this, we need to touch on a little theory. And I know some of you start going, oh God, theory. Do I really have to learn theory? Like so-and-so didn't know theory. Do you like my dumb guy voice? I'm not the least bit judgmental about these things. But the fact is, if you are gifted enough that you have an intuitive understanding of all this stuff, you're not watching this right now. If you are watching this, if this topic is of interest to you, then this is stuff you need to know. Not in the way that you have to be thinking all the time about what you do, but in the way that music theory helps you organize and categorize your thoughts, your ideas, your raw materials. It simply gives you a good filing system for musical sounds. Gives you a way to identify what things are, and by doing that, giving you a better understanding of when we use them. It's pretty simple. Now, we started off by referring everything back to a major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. So I'd like to do that again, and then work our way back into modes, and ultimately today looking also at the Mixolydian mode and how that is different from the major / Ionian and the natural minor / Aeolian and the Dorian that we looked at last week. So if I just come back to the open position, here is do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I've got a C chord. I'm starting from my ring finger here on the 3rd fret of the A string, C, open D, 2nd fret E, 3rd fret F, open G, A, open B, 1st fret C. You may have learned that fingering. If you haven't, if you learned all your scales, 3 notes per string, caged, all the stuff up and down the neck, but you still can't play an open position C major scale, you're missing something. There's a real understanding of the layout of the guitar that's going to come from this, but before we do that, we have to take that scale and express it in another form. If I start from this same C, you probably already know, especially if you've been practicing movable shapes of any kind, that includes scale forms, that includes bar chords, then you already know that things can be moved up and down the neck, and if you move in this direction, what I'm going to call up the neck, because never mind the fact that my neck is pointing this way, the pitch goes up when we go this direction. So this is up the neck, this is down the neck. I said that learning the geography can be confusing. The fact that the guitar is upside down and backwards doesn't help. But what eventually happens is your musical mind simply perceives the gesture. When I go up the neck, I don't have to think about which way is up. I hear up and my hand moves in the direction that will produce up. This is, again, the stuff that comes with intuition, but it also comes with time and practice and experience. So, here is my C chord. If you don't know how to identify a single note on the guitar, you can start by using things you do know to give you a reference. So, for example, a C chord is built on a C note. here on the 3rd fret of the 5th string. And I can play that same C major scale without leaving the 5th string. Just gliding up the neck, and as long as I know the distances I need to go, I can play that scale. So I might take the C that we ended on, and if I follow the same sequence of 2 fret moves, a whole step, and 1 fret moves, a half step, I'll produce a C major scale. Now you should know that a 2 fret distance is a whole step. A 1 fret distance is a half step. This is important information. You should be aware of this. You should also be aware that when you play the natural notes across the open position on the guitar, it will show you which natural notes are a whole step or a half step apart. Again, this is information you should have if you don't have it. I'm not going to advocate for becoming a great music reader, although it is never going to hurt you. And honestly, I think knowing how to read music is a fantastic skill, and I'm really glad I know how to do it. I get a lot of satisfaction out of it, and it makes life very easy when I want to notate things for myself. But with that said, even just starting off by knowing the names of the notes first of the 6 open strings, E, A, D, G, B, E, and in the open position, just say the first 4 frets of each string. So on the E string we get E, F, G. On the A string we get A, B, C. On the D string, D, E, F. On the G string, G, A. On the B string, B, C, D. On the E string, E, F, G. If we were to write all that out, you'd just follow the music alphabet. E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, D, F, G. Anyway, tripped over my tongue, but you know what I meant to do there. That is worth memorizing if you haven't. And again, you can relate the low notes to chords you know. C chord gives you a C note. G chord gives you a G note. Some of the open chords you have to account for open strings. D chord, D note, D string, A chord, A string. Anyway, this is all information you should be learning. But here's the point that I want to make. I want you to know where C is at the beginning of that scale and at the end. I want you to be able to walk through the open position. E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I want you to recognize as you do that, if you're paying attention to the notes you're on, that every time you play E and F, they're only a half step apart. Here too. And here. By the way, interesting to note that even though all I did was play E's and F's, if you remember when we were talking about the natural minor scale and the very distinctive sound of flat 6, 5, and now when you hear, say for example in the key of A minor, there's 5 flat 6 5. I can almost guarantee that that was what you perceived even before I played the A minor chord. Now that you've heard A minor, you've got A in your ear, we can kind of cleanse the sonic palette. So you probably don't have a tonal center in your ear anymore, but when I do this, I bet your ear is expecting so that should actually make a point about how we hear a sound, da-dee-da, and because you're used to hearing it in certain settings, immediately your musical memory connects what you just heard to the settings you've heard that in before. That's what this course is really all about, learning how to recognize those sounds. But what I'm focused on right now is that E and F are a half step apart, no matter where you are on the guitar. Same goes for B and C. E, F, G, A, B, C. Also here. All your other natural notes are a whole step apart. So A to B, 2 frets, whole step. We've already established B to C is a half. C to D, well, we're crossing strings, but you should know that the D note is also here, a step up from C. So here's your fretted D, and here's your open D. So whole step from D to E, C to D. Whole step from D to E. Half step E to F. Whole step F to G. Again, we cross strings, but if you think about the fact that G is duplicated here, not really a big deal. And G to A is a whole step. Just remember, naturally occurring half steps. Picture a piano keyboard. The 2 places there is no black key between 2 white keys are B, C, and E, F. Why does this matter? Because you want to get to learn the interval structure of a major scale. And then we're going to manipulate that to figure out how to change that scale. So I'm going to start from this C here. Now, I'm following a specific pattern. I want you to just notice 2 frets or 1 fret. And I'm going to call out whole step or half step. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, half step. So, from wherever you started, here are the letters C, D, E, F, there's a half step, G, A, B, C, there's a half step. So just you remember from wherever you started, whole, half, whole, half. Now, you do not need to think about key signatures in all the letter names right now, other than just to remember that a scale is going to use every letter. No matter what scale you're on, doesn't matter if it's a natural, a sharp, or a flat, you're going to use A through G in order and not skipping or duplicating any of those letters. Doesn't matter where we started from. And the pattern of whole and half steps is identical no matter where we start. So I can start from open D and go whole, half, whole, half, and there's a D major scale. I can start from E flat, whole, half, whole, half. So I can start from anywhere and just follow 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret, 2 frets, 2 frets, 2 frets, 1 fret. Just make sure that you are, as you do this, keeping in your ear that we have a starting point, which is a root, and then when you apply whole, half, whole, half, you still have to hear that this note is our starting point, our root, and you should be able to hear pretty clearly when we get to that octave. So when you play the open position C major scale, whether it's here, you're still playing whole step C to D, whole step D to E, half step E to F, cross strings from fret 3 is a whole step, cross strings here is a whole step, half step. If I play that C scale with this fingering, something else that was introduced previously, it's the same thing. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step. And here's the beautiful thing. It does not matter whether you have learned 3 notes per string, caged, open position, all of the above. Every single one of these major scales has that exact pattern. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Okay? Now, this is important because I've been talking about scale degrees and how the way we learn to recognize where we are in a melodic sequence is by understanding how the note you're playing relates back to the root. So, if I take, say, this fingering for a C major scale, we've already talked about how to pull major down to major pentatonic by leaving out some notes. So instead of 1 through 8, this time I'm just going to go 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 8. And you can review back to week 2, I believe, is when we went over this. Week 1 or week 2. Here's another alternative 3-note per string fingering for a major scale and for the major pentatonic. Notice how I switched the fingering, but it's just because it felt so natural. I mean, if I'm not going to use this note, then to do this 1, middle, pinky, you should be able to reach that. And there are going to be times that's the right thing to do, but there is nothing wrong with having the shift there, and probably in many, if not most situations, that's how most players would do it. Just don't let the shift throw off your understanding of whole step, note 1, note 2, note 3 in sequence. So when we want the major pentatonic, we're going to go 1, 2, 3, note 5, note 6. And of course I can do it here, 2, 3, 5, 6, or here, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. And the numbers that I'm calling out are the scale degrees, the position in the scale sequence, not a fret. Okay? Be aware of that. Major pentatonic becomes minor pentatonic when we replace 3 with flat 3, leave out the 2, add 4, leave out the 6, go to flat 7. Oops. We probably wouldn't do that. And we jumped up because this fingering, if I was doing this before, this is where the 7th is, here on fret 9, 6th, I'm sorry. Oh no, okay, no, that's all good because we do have the B here. So I'm replacing E with E flat. I'm replacing B with B flat, leaving out the 2, leaving out the 6. That's minor pentatonic. So again, it's derived from the major scale. We just got there 2 steps removed. There are other ways you can get there. You can learn all the different formulas. But just if you see all of these things as being sort of superimposed on top of each other, learning scales from the way they relate to each other, you will be a whole lot better equipped to actually use them than if you just memorize the fingerings. Although, there is nothing wrong, and I've been talking about, nothing wrong with thinking about visualize, here's a whole step, here's a whole step, note 1, note 2, note 3, but look at this, a half step. So, just seeing E natural, E flat. I've mentioned before the abacus concept, the idea of if you picture beads on an abacus, think of the notes as being those beads, and all you have to do to change the scale is to slide bead 3 over by a half step from this spot to this one. Now, so we've taken major, we've made it into major pentatonic, we made that into minor pentatonic. We can also just fill in the 4 and the flat 6, the 2 and the flat 6 to get now natural minor. And we've done all of this. Go back and review natural minor, should have been week 4. Again, abacus concept. Think about the shifting notes. 1, 2, 3 becomes 1, 2, flat 3. Here's 4, here's 5. We had 6 and 7, but we're going to do flat 6 and flat 7. So watch this. Major. Natural minor. Does change your fingering, because instead of reaching up to F up here, which I really don't need to do, we could, but why if you can play it right here? So then my fingering might be this. But either way, I mean, even if you did this, no matter what fingering you use, the interval structure is the same, and the sound of what flat 3 sounds like, the sound of what flat 6 sounds like is consistent. And I hope all this is making sense. If everything is getting a little bit overwhelming with all this material piling up, go back and review the videos of the previous weeks, because it's really important that not only you learn each of these, but that you make the connection between them. Now, I said that today we're going to touch on the Mixolydian mode. And the Mixolydian mode is more closely related to major than it is to minor. And I say that because it has a minor third. Here's C major. Here's C Mixolydian. And some of you might be going, well, wait a minute, Dave, I didn't hear the difference. But listen closely. Compared to so major, Mixolydian. Now, you notice that when I start really improvising, I step out of the boxes, because real improvisation doesn't live in boxes. We can just do the box improvisation because it's a very convenient way to organize your thoughts, and this is exactly what I was recommending in the earlier courses. I still recommend it now, just to limit your choices. Because let's face it, if the territory you know is in one small area of the neck, then while you're trying to get to know the sound, stay in the territory you know, get to know it better, and then add on another position. So if you've been working at learning your scales by learning every shape and every key up and down the neck, that's admirable and that's good, but it's entirely possible that you are developing broad knowledge without any depth, and that is not going to make that information useful. The depth comes from understanding what you're doing. So, talking back about interval structures, major scale, and you should know this, so I'm going to reiterate, is whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, and that gives us 1, major second, major third, 4th, 5th, major 6th, major 7th. Mixolydian simply replaces 7 with flat 7. And when I say flat, if I describe a flat 3 or a flat 7, one very important factor you need to keep in mind, I am not necessarily naming the note. Just because I say a note is a flat 7 doesn't mean there's a flat in the name. Flat is a noun in the sense that a note can be named B flat, but it's also a verb in the sense that flat means to lower by a half step. So arguably the note B flat is actually saying the note B in which you have performed the operation of lowering by a half step. That's a long, complicated way of saying B flat. But I simply mean that when I say flat the seventh, I mean literally take note 7 and make it a half step lower. Replace note 7 with the note a half step below it. So what did that just do? That took our major scale, which has a very specific and distinctive sound, for a variety of reasons, but most of all because of the combination of the major 3, mi, re, do, 3 blind mice, right, and the major 7th. And the way that that 7th note, what we call the leading tone, that's another term for note 7 of a major scale, specifically a major scale. Remember whole, whole, half, whole, whole, or rather, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. 7 to 8, or rather note 7 to the octave, the repetition of the note we started on, an octave higher, is a half step. When we flat the 7, beads on the abacus, becomes so, becomes we now have a note that's a half step below the root. Let's play with this a little bit against a backing track, except that I'm going to transpose. I'm going to use a track in A. So first of all, let's take an A. Whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. So instead, flat the 7. See, that puts a half step between 6 and 7, which is a different sound. Here's the open position A major. Here's fretted. Here is Mixolydian. Half step, there's your flat 7. It was here. Beads on the abacus, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And notice that that note is dissonant. It still wants to resolve, but not nearly as strongly as major. It just changes the vibe a little bit. So now listen to this against an A track, and this is specifically now, I should say, a vamp, which is neither major nor minor, and you have heard this one in this course before. And I'm just going to play a Mixolydian over it. All sounds good. Garcia impression. Grateful Dead used this a lot, as did the Allman Brothers. Anyway, now let's play over this again, But let's go back to the idea of phrasing. So this is an exercise that you could do. You're not going to do this exactly as I did because I am improvising, but we're just going to listen for notes of the scale, trying to make a mental note of at least recognizing the 3 in that flat 7 and working from this fingering. All right, so I'm going to walk up and down that scale against the same track that I did, but this time I'm really going to focus on phrasing and my note choices. Point being that when I land on a note and stay there, it's a note that sounds like it's going to blend, and when I emphasize a note in a dissonant way, I'm going to need to resolve it. I'll show you what I mean. Resolve. But it could go up. It wants to resolve. I'm phrasing, repeating that idea, but let's go higher. Not in the chord. Nice modal sound, even though it's not the definitive note of Mixolydian. This is. This half step from 5 to 6. Now, I'll run the scale again. If I stop on a non-chord tone, it needs to resolve. Notes of an A major. If I add the G natural, then what I actually just played were the notes of an A7, arpeggio, A, C sharp, E, G. Let's do it from this fretted fingering so it relates to our scale. A, C sharp, A, G, A, C sharp, E, G. I said A twice. A, C sharp, E, G. 5th fret pinky, 4th fret ring, 2nd fret index, 5th fret pinky, index, index, pinky, middle. So actually, those notes, since they make up a dominant 7th chord, the Mixolydian scale could be called a dominant scale because it goes with a 7th chord. So I can play over an A7 very nicely with this scale, but I can play over a straight A major also. That doesn't actually change anything. Now, the other thing you should know chordally, or at least in terms of, I suppose the big question we should be answering is, when do you use Mixolydian? Well, what I just played over was a vamp, right? Meaning that you heard the same sound, it was one chord, and it wasn't major or minor, it was this. So over a vamp like that, I can choose major or minor because the chord is not including a major or minor third. It just gives us the greatest possible leeway in terms of the number of notes that can fit. But if we're going to something that has more of an A major sound, that's going to change things. Here's the thing, how do you know if you can use Mixolydian? Well, the tones of a scale give you the chords that belong to the key. Right? You probably know what that means. And that means that there are for every scale, there are certain chords that you can construct by simply taking notes from that scale. The 7 notes of any major scale will give you a whole variety of chords. A major 1, a minor 2, a minor 3, a minor 4, major 5, minor 6, diminished 7, and back. I'm not even asking you or expecting you to memorize all that. That isn't necessarily the point. But what we are thinking about is that by changing G sharp to G natural, we've added a note that's not in the scale, in the major scale, therefore we need to change a chord. Well, it would kind of stand to reason that if the note that I've gone to is G instead of G sharp, then I probably need a G chord, and that would be true. There are an awful lot of songs that use patterns like A, G, D, A. You know, lots of songs like that. If we look at that in terms of the chord progression, classifying what those chords are, we have a 1 chord. We have a flat 7. Flat 7 because, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 was a G sharp and we want a G natural. So that's going to be in addition to our possible chords. We can use G, and you know what? We haven't even left the key of A just by replacing one note of the A major scale. We've altered one tone, but to say we're no longer in A would be silly because A still sounds like your musical home even with this change. And we want to hear a resolution from G natural just like we want to from G sharp, it's just a different resolution. So we've established that A and G are good chords. If we have a combination of A and G in a track, in a song, then Mixolydian is going to work very well. And all the other chords that are coming from that major scale will work as well as long as they don't include the G sharp. So B minor works, C sharp minor does not, D works, E major does not. We would need an E minor because E major contains the leading tone. So if you have a major key progression that uses a major 5 chord, if you're in A, it's an E chord. If you are in C, it's a G chord. Then there is going to be a clash if you hit that Mixolydian note, that flat 7, over that chord, because then you end up with this. But we can still make it work. Check this out. This track has 2 sections. The first section is A, G, and D. The second section is E major, G, D, A. So we do have to account for the E chord, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to avoid the note that would clash. I'm not going to hit G or G sharp when we're on the E chord. But let's concentrate first just on the A, G, D part of the chord progression. So here's what the track sounds like. Here we go. So I'm going to start off by just playing the Mixolydian. Now, if I go to major, look what happens. All right, I'm going to stop it there for a second. It works, sort of, but it doesn't work nearly as well. And if I go beyond playing just over just the scale, and I start phrasing, then you'll notice the major really doesn't work so well unless I avoid G sharp. It's okay. That's bad. That's weird. Not so good, right? But G and D, right? So this time, I'm going to focus on following that chord change down to G. That means that I'm mentally identifying where are my A's. And when I can, when the chord goes to G, I'm going to use that G note. Here's the change, E chord. G chord. We're back. Now, I did have to choose my notes more carefully. If we did not have that E chord to account for, I could just stay doing more or less the same thing, okay? But because of that chord and the danger of this sound, I have to choose things a little bit differently. Now, there is no absolute, there is no one way that you learn how to do this. It takes time, it takes experience. But I will point out, referring back to this idea of how, say, a naturally, intuitively gifted musician processes this stuff. They are understanding the relationships intuitively, making connections between one thing and another, which is really what intuition is good at doing. Okay? So you just have to look for those connections. And what we're looking for is, hey, I heard that sound over that chord change. So for example, when you hear recognize, oh, that's not major. Think of how many songs just use two chords. That sounds very Grateful Dead, but I mean, as I do that you're recognizing the sound of that flat 7 when you hear it, okay? Now, if you really want to reinforce this, and this is fun anyway, you can try experimenting on a single string too, and following the whole and half steps. So check this out. I'm going to go back to my vamp just over just over A to start with. So this is that slow A5 vamp, but check this out. I'm going to go from A on the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. Whole step, half step, whole step, half step. Oh, sorry, whole step, half step. Did that wrong. Let me do it again. Here we go. Whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. If I've identified my octave, then I know a whole step down, and then I know a half step from there is my 6. So here is one of your distinctive Mixolydian sounds, flat 7, major 6, which you might remember is also in the Dorian, except the Dorian has a minor 3rd. So this is Dorian. Let me try a simple example. If you remember, little Santana-ish melody. Now, minor tonality, minor flavor if I go to a major 3rd, but keep the rest of the notes the same, now we get Mixolydian. So check this out. Dorian. Mixolydian. There, I can mix them and it all sounds good. But I say that it all sounds good because it was a vamp. There is no major third or minor third in that chord progression. Not even a chord progression. It's an A and E. That's basically the whole deal. So you have room to choose one or the other. When you have other chords, you can't do that quite so easily. So let's hear over this modal track, A, G, D. And again, this time I'm just sort of free improvising, but I want you to pay attention to my phrasing, and I want you to pay attention to what notes you hear, particularly when you hear the signature sound of that Mixolydian. So here we go. So I added some chromatics, but here's the E. Now if I start combining, how about a little minor pentatonic? How about Dorian? Mixolydian. Major pentatonic. Mixed up. That was A minor pentatonic. A major pentatonic. Dorian. I hope the point is clear. You see that I could use them all as long as I listened to where I landed. That should tell you something very important. People say, what scale should I use over this chord progression? That's important information. That is stuff you should know. But the reason why some people say don't learn scales is that they do not want you locked into that kind of thinking. Understand that there are different degrees of assimilating this information. You might have it consciously where you can apply it. What in learning sequences is called conscious competence. You look at something and you understand from looking at it that you know what to do. But then there is unconscious competence in which you just intuitively know what to do. This is the thing that your naturally gifted people can do. And this is something that happens as you continue to practice, as you continue to study and grow and develop. You do develop that conscious work through a process of assimilation into your brain, and I'm forgetting what the technical term actually for it is, but there is literally a process where the things you learn consciously filter into your unconscious. They become muscle memory, they become background information, software running in the background as opposed that's affecting what the computer, what the machine does. There's a lot of information here, but I think if you do some reviewing, go back and check out what we've done in previous weeks, and you'll see how all this applies, how it all ties together. And I'm really hoping that you are beginning to hear how these different modes can be identified by their definitive sounds and not just by letter names or fingerings. And that's what's going to really be crucial in your development as an improviser and a lead guitar player. All right, I see we've got a question from Vince, and it's a very good question, about the whole, whole, half pattern. And Vince says, does using a capo change the whole, whole, half pattern of the scale? And the answer is no. Essentially, the capo is making your neck shorter because it is taking the nut or rather, it is replacing the nut. It is acting as the nut. So if I put a capo on the 1st fret, it's like my guitar neck is 1 fret shorter. If I put it on the 7th fret, then it's this much shorter. And this is one of the things that people use capos for. It's not just for changing keys. Classical guitarists will sometimes use a capo on the 3rd fret when they play lute music because a lute was a smaller instrument and had a smaller scale, so it changes the tone. So it changes the sound and it changes the pitch, but when we talk about the scale, the whole and half step patterns, remember that we're talking about a set of relative relationships. That's the whole idea, that no matter where you start from, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half is consistent for a major scale. So it doesn't matter if I start from an open string, or the 1st fret, or the 5th. And so if I had a capo on here at the 5th fret, it's no different than if I just started from the 5th fret. Now, if I'm playing across the strings, say, again, we have not changed the relationship between the strings, so the patterns are identical. Whether I play that scale in the 1st position, fretted in the 5th position, or capoed, same sound. So the whole idea, and this is the whole reason that I think the major scale is such a great way, a great reference for holding all of this stuff together, is that it's a very familiar sound and an absolute constant. And so all your other scales are simply variations on that. And what's really going to happen when you master this stuff is you are no longer thinking about scales, you're just thinking about sounds. Just like when I was demonstrating, here's a pentatonic lick, here's a major pentatonic lick, here's a mixolydian lick, here's a major lick, here's a minor lick. All of those notes are available to you. So excellent question. Okay. D. Stark says, when you say root, do you mean root of the scale or root of the key? When I'm talking about the scale, we are just taking that scale and assuming that it is establishing a key for us. So if I'm talking about a C scale, those notes are in the key of C, and so the root of the C scale is the root of the key of C. And the same would go for any major scale, really any key, is that the whole point is that the scale is giving you the diatonic notes. The scale is telling you what notes actually belong to that key, right? So that's important. And you can look at scale and key as being related but not quite interchangeable concepts. And I say this because if you were just looking for the notes that belong to a major key, let's say the key of C, then C, D, E, F, G, A, B are the notes. Those are the notes that make up the key of C, or what we would call the diatonic notes. However, the bigger concept, and this is the thing that I think people don't always take into account, is that the key can include notes that weren't in the scale, because key is a concept and a sonic, what's the best way to put this? Your concept of a key has to do with your concept of a musical home. If I play a C major scale and stop on the 7th, on the B, no one who has grown up hearing the music that we all listen to, the musical language we all know, no one has ever said to me when I ask, am I done? No one has ever said yes. Not done until here. That note sounds like it's hanging in the air, waiting for something to happen, and we resolve. That, conceptually, is what a key really means. The whole way that our musical system works is that when you are in a key, your ear perceives that as home, the starting point that at some point we need to get back to. Now, a song doesn't have to start on the root, doesn't have to start on the one chord, doesn't have to end on the root or the one chord. But the most final sound, the most final sounding resolution you can hear is going to be that. Now, this relates nicely, actually, to the next question, Abby's question. Is there ever a time that you would start the scale on a half step? Sure, but it depends. See, understand that whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half is the sequence that creates a major scale. So if we don't follow that sequence, if we started with a half step instead of a whole step, we are not playing a major scale. As long as you're still looking at what I was saying a moment ago, of one of the scale is one of the key. But you don't have to start from one of the scale, as I just said, and likely you won't. Let's say, for example, we're in the key of C. And I can reinforce this by playing a chord pattern. Good, strong resolution. Now, what if I start from the third of the chord? And I've mentioned how you can learn to recognize these different tones of the scale, different tones of the chord, meaning the same thing, by the way. The third of a C scale is the same note as the third of a C chord. That has a distinctive sound. I hear, as I mentioned, I hear three blind mice. And I think once you hear that in your head, you will always be able to hear three blind mice as starting with the third of a chord. So this note sounds great because it's in the chord. If I play the scale starting from E, it could sound like I'm using E Mixolydian, but I bet it doesn't. Even if I do that, those are the note, not Mixolydian, Phrygian, which starts with a half step. That's why I'm using that example. But I bet you didn't hear Phrygian. If I do this, now you're hearing Phrygian because I made E the tonal center. But E isn't the tonal center. We're going to do this. And then you don't hear that as one anymore. You hear it as three blind mice. So if I started with a half step, it's because I didn't start from one. And we can start on any note of the scale. I can start on 7 and have a half step. But what you'll hear is you will not hear Locrian, you will hear C major. And so if you remember, say for example, well, there's an old Bob Seger song called Still the Same. Melodies BC. Except you don't hear, oh, it's just a half step. You are hearing the gravitational pull of 1 of C major. C is the sun. Everything revolves around it. And I think the best way to understand the key is, along with the scale, to recognize that your perception of how that note sounds is actually colored by the way you're imagining the root in your musical ear, in your internal intuitive ear. You may not think you don't have one, but I bet you do. And this is something we're going to continue to explore as we go on with these courses. So I really appreciate your watching. Please come back next week, and I hope that you're getting a lot out of this. Feel free to reach out to me. I will be checking my Jam Play messages just to make sure if anybody has more questions, and join me on a Q&A. You can look on the calendar to see when I'm going to be online if you have a direct question you wanted to ask live. So again, thanks for watching. Dave Isaacs with you, and I'll see you next time.